Hello everyone, and welcome to Transcendent Philosophy. This is Seth here, and today we're going to be discussing one of my blog entries on the topic of morality. Specifically, we're going to be discussing Hume's guillotine, the is-ought problem, or the is-ought gap, and we're going to be discussing different ways to think about moral logic and maybe how to structure it. David Hume was an English philosopher in the 1700s, and with just one paragraph, David Hume sparked a debate that would last for the ages. And this is the quote. "In every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I have always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in an ordinary way of reasoning, and establishes the being of a god, or makes observations concerning human affairs, when of a sudden I am surprised to find that instead of usual copulations of propositions, is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. The change is imperceptible, but is, however, of last consequence. For as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, it's necessary that it should be observed and explained, and at the same time that a reason should be given, for what seems altogether inconceivable. How this new relation can be a deduction from others, which are entirely different from it. But as authors do not commonly use this precaution, I shall presume to recommend it to the readers, and am persuaded that this small attention would subvert all the vulgar systems of morality, and let us see that the distinction of vice and virtue is not founded merely on the relations of objects, nor is perceived by reason." Essentially, Hume is saying that people frequently smuggle in moral assumptions. They're smuggling these oughts into their logic without making them explicit. Hume is telling us that we can't just go from fact to moral judgment, right? We can't go from is to ought. And this concept of the Hume's guillotine, it's used as a metaphoric punishment for those who break this rule of logic. In order to reach a moral conclusion, you need to first define your moral axiom. You need to specify your MetaOught. Then, and only then, can you logically derive moral conclusions from the facts. For example, the following would be an is clause. My pet snake is suffering from hunger. That's just a fact, the nature of the snake. But from this fact, someone might jump to a conclusion. An ought clause could be assumed. I ought to feed my pet snake. I ought to feed my pet snake some mice. Technically, from the perspective of logic, it does not necessarily follow that just because your pet snake is hungry, that you ought to feed him some mice. There's some missing logic here. There's some missing assumptions. So without first exposing your moral assumptions, you can't logically deduce this moral conclusion, and therefore, this lands you in Hume's guillotine. Ka-chunk. My pet snake is suffering from hunger. I ought to feed my pet snake some mice. Ka-chunk. At first glance, this seems like a very common sense conclusion for what we ought to do. Yet, if we think about it a little bit more deeply, there are several assumptions being made in order for us to derive this conclusion. Some of our moral logic is at the subconscious layer. So now we're going to jump back a layer of logic and try to see what's going on. And in relation to these mice that we're planning to feed the snake, we've got a little bit of a contradiction because all mice suffer when they're fed to snakes. That's a fact. But for some reason, there's this ought that appears, which is I ought to value my pet snake's well-being over that of many mice, right? Somehow, somewhere in our logic, this snake is being bumped up in moral value over all these mice. And we've got another contradiction, which is, well, there are many snakes. There are many snakes in the wild. And we've got facts about these wild snakes, which is all wild snakes are suffering from hunger. And so somehow, somewhere, we are assuming another type of an ought, which is I ought to value the well-being of my pet snake over that of other snakes in the wild. And so we need to think for a little bit about what's going on here. we've got multiple oughts being assumed in the background that are somewhat contradictory in nature. And so maybe if we go back even a further layer of depth, we might be able to start to figure out what's going on here, right? And so there might be a fact about who is within our emotional tribe. So a further layer back in logic, we might be able to see that there's this fact that mice are not a part of my emotional tribe. And then there might be this ought, which is I ought to only value those animals that are within my emotional tribe. Similarly, these wild snakes are not a part of my emotional tribe. And I only ought to value those animals that are within my emotional tribe. So the deeper we go, the more we start to expose these fundamental biases that are guiding our moral conclusions. And so we can keep playing this game of trying to dig deeper into these assumptions behind our moral thoughts, feelings, and conclusions, and we might find some patterns that are interesting. I think in this example, it's starting to show a meta value, right? There's these MetaOughts, and they all seem to be downstream of this meta value of I value my tribe, right? Just axiomatically, we have this feeling of valuing our tribe, and then our brains, they might be structured to attach things in our environment. Oh, this snake is in my environment, so now that is attaching to the tribal structure in my brain. And so now this snake, it can obtain all of the values that are associated with being a member of my tribe. And so this I value my tribe axiom, it can guide the downstream morality when we start attaching things to that value system. Now the skeptic is going to ask, well, where is your justification for this axiom, right? Is there some scientific proof for why you should value your tribe, right? And so when you keep going deeper, you kind of get stuck in this trap of, I don't know where else to go deeper. I just have this feeling, I have this value, and that everything is flowing downstream from that, right? And so this is kind of the problem of subjectivity. And a lot of people like to criticize morality for its subjective nature. They're like, well, that just opens the door to moral relativism. Well, in my other videos, my other blogs, I go deeper into how to overcome this problem, right? And just the quick answer is, while our experience of morality is fundamentally subjective, it supervenes on evolutionary psychology, it supervenes on evolutionary game theory. And what that means is our feelings are attached to this objective pattern, right? There's this objective strategy that evolution is guiding us towards. And so the better we adhere to this objective strategy, the better we succeed as creatures in the game of life. And the more we violate this objective strategy, the more we fail to succeed in the game of evolution. The problem with evolution is it creates variety. Each individual is going to have a different value system, and the most core values are going to align because what's most essential for our humanity, evolution is going to try to guarantee we keep the most essential things, but the peripheral things might have mutations, right? And so there's going to be some variety in our individuality, in our approaches to morality, but the thing that we need to think about is our moral conclusions come from our moral system, right? And our moral system might be different from the objectively correct moral system, right? Some people might be more correct than others, depending on how close they get to that objective standard. But when we are trying to understand our morality, when we're trying to deduce our own morality, we're going to be starting with our values and deducing downwards from that. And so in this example, our MetaOught, or our meta value, is to value the tribe. I ought to value my tribe. And then there's a next layer of ought, which is I ought to value tribal animals over other animals. And then another layer of oughts, which is I ought to value my pet snake over mice and over wild snakes. So I've been using this prefix meta quite a lot. So just to make sure we're on the same page here, the way I'm using meta is to refer or denote something of a higher order, second order kind. Right? We're talking about a deeper layer of logic that's guiding further logic. So a meta is, for example, when we're talking about like the fact side of the equation, that which is going to be a fact, and you might have a meta is, which is a deeper fact about reality. And a MetaOught would be a deeper ought that guides many oughts downstream of it. And a meta value would be a deeper value. And there are lots of interesting synonyms that we can think about. Getting into this semantics of is versus ought, this fact-value distinction. It's useful to try to categorize all of these loosely synonymous terms to try to help us orient our thought patterns across this dichotomy. So under the is column, we've got facts, situations, circumstances, reality, science, ontology, our starting point, objectivity, and truth, right? The is half of the equation. And now on the ought side, we've got values, we've got should, we've got goals, we have purpose and morality and axiology. We've got destination and subjectivity and goodness. And so according to Hume, there's a logical gap between these two columns, right? Between the is and the ought, between facts and values, between the situation and what you should do, between the circumstance and your goal, between reality and purpose, between science and morality, between ontology and axiology, between your starting point and your destination, between objectivity and subjectivity, between truth and goodness. And so Hume's question is, what are you using to justify your values? It's like, okay, you have a goal, but why do you have that goal? Okay, you have a purpose, but why do you have that purpose, right? And so perhaps there's a deeper goal that's guiding your superficial goal. And there's a deeper purpose that's guiding your superficial purpose, right? So that's what Hume is asking for, a deeper justification. So moral math, this is where this is coming to. Logic is kind of structured like math. You've got your premises and you got your conclusion. And so with this moral type of a deduction, we need to conjoin a MetaOught with an is clause, right? The is clause is not enough to deduce an ought. But if you conjoin a MetaOught to an is, then you are justified in going to an ought. But you might discover that this problem of justification, right? Hume is kind of alluding to a problem of justification. You claim to have this ought, but what is justifying it? And so we develop this meta-ought in order to justify the ought, but that just pushes the problem back a step. Now we slide the meta-ought over. It's like, okay, you have this meta-ought, but what justifies the meta-ought? Uh-oh, we've got to go back a layer and find a meta-meta-ought to justify the meta-ought. And in my future videos on this topic, I discuss in more detail how this creates an infinite regress. And so it's a problematic issue to resolve, but I think it's resolvable. And so you should check out my other video on the is-ought solution to get more context for that. But at least within this example, we've got a meta-ought, which is I ought to value my tribe. And then we're going to conjoin that to the statement, my pet snake is within my tribe. Therefore, I ought to value my pet snake over other animals. Similarly, I ought to value my pet snake over other animals. My pet snake is hungry. I ought to feed my pet snake some mice. Now that we've got these meta-oughts, we can start to create a deductive chain that is deductively valid. So how does this apply to society, right? This is kind of a silly example about a pet snake. But what about morality in the more broad social context? Well, when we want to vote for laws or figure out how morality can guide social policy, We need to think about what's the kind of moral paradigm that we're operating under. And so the democratic perspective of morality, there's some assumptions embedded in there, right? So you can think about, like, there's a meta-is. Within reality, we have this meta-is, which is humans naturally value justice. That's a fact about the majority of humanity. But that fact about human nature alone does not justify the MetaOught conclusion, which is we have a moral duty to pursue justice, right? This violates the naturalistic fallacy, right? The naturalistic fallacy is an invalid logical argument. It's basically structured like something is natural, therefore something is good, right? It's natural to value justice, therefore we ought to pursue justice. Well, that's just a Hume's guillotine problem. You can't go from fact to value. We need something more robust than that. And so when we think about the democratic perspective of morality, the question is, what's that assumption? What's that MetaOught underlying that democratic process? So if the majority of humans value justice, why should we instantiate that into law? The democratic perspective on morality is implicitly relying on the MetaOught. We ought to socially organize around principles that the majority of people value, right? We should trust the morality of the majority, right? It's basically the majority of people have a good moral system. The majority of people have good moral values, right? That's the MetaOught. Only by conjoining this MetaOught to the meta-is can we get the conclusion that we ought to follow this democratic process of defining morality based on the majority. So going back a layer, we've got a second order MetaOught. We ought to value the majority opinion. And then we're conjoining that to a second order meta-is. The majority naturally values justice. With these two conjoined, we get the MetaOught. We have a moral duty to value justice. So there was a philosopher, G.E. Moore. He coined another type of naturalistic fallacy, which was reducing that which is pleasurable or desirable or pleasant to that which is good. So G.E. Moore's naturalistic fallacy is basically like something is pleasurable, therefore something is good. That just is another type of this is-ought gap, another type of the Hume's guillotine. The problem is you can't go from is to ought, right? You can't go from this is pleasant, therefore we ought to do it, right? It's not logically coherent. And so we need to think about this MetaOught. And sometimes the other type of fallacy is called the appeal to nature, whatever. The point is, morality is complicated, right? Morality is natural because essentially everything is natural, but bad things are natural too, right? Immorality is also natural. So there's a difference between what's natural and what's moral, because what's natural is bigger in scope than what's moral and immoral. Morality and immorality are subsets of what is natural. And so we've got to figure out how to distinguish the natural things that become moral and the natural things that become immoral, right? Murderers are natural, but we don't view them as moral, we view them as immoral. So to our common intuitions, we've got this idea of what goodness is, but a lot of the subconscious assumptions, a lot of our meta-oughts are so deep in our brain, we jump to these moral conclusions and we have no idea where they came from. So we have to dig down into our subconscious to figure out the value systems that produced those conclusions. And there's always the problem of moral relativism, which is, how do we know which morality is right? Well, maybe the murderer has his own morality. Maybe in his value system, murder is good. Who are we to say his moral system is wrong? Maybe we're the wrong ones to say he's evil, right? So one culture says slavery is good, another says slavery is evil. How do you judge? So this gets into the topic of objectivity versus subjectivity. Many people gravitate towards objective morality, which is kind of a position that assumes that there's a definition of goodness that is written in the cosmos, right? There is there's this law, a divine law. The 10 Commandments have been written down. These are timeless laws of morality that are just so concrete that they can't be questioned. They surpass any critique of moral relativism, right? That's what the draw towards objective morality. They want something sturdy that can save them from this moral nihilism where they don't know where to turn to for answers. The problem is this type of traditional objective morality, it just doesn't exist. There's no definition of morality written into the cosmos, right? You can't zoom in at the microscopic level and see moral laws written at the level of, quantum phenomena. It's just not there. And attempts to measure sources of objective morality, they struggle a lot, at least traditional types, right? Trying to find evidence for God as a source. It just doesn't work. Spiritual experiences, they're based on a variety of fallacies and evidence is against them. People are using their religious biases to interpret more to their experience than is justified. If prayers worked, we would be able to measure their effects, right? We've got lots of tools for measuring things. We've got really good scientific experiments that are testing prayer, and it's not producing reliable results that it works, right? If God existed, we could hypothetically measure his location and measure his impact on the world, and we could make predictions based on if God has these types of intentions, we should measure these effects on reality based on his influence in the world. It just doesn't work. And if ghosts exist, we could measure them, but we can't find them even with our best particle accelerators. And so the accumulation of evidence shows that all of these religious approaches to morality are just not justified. It looks a lot more like wishful thinking rather than evidence-based conclusions about reality. But here's the kicker. Even if God existed, traditional objective morality still wouldn't exist, because this traditional type of objective morality violates Hume's guillotine. Could be an is clause. God defines goodness. That's just a fact. God tries to define it. But there's a conclusion. We ought to obey God's definition of goodness, right? Well, where did that come from, right? Just because God defines goodness doesn't mean we should adopt God's definition, right? There's a subjective judgment where we have to observe this process. We have to observe God defining goodness, and we have to choose whether or not we want to accept his definition, right? What if we think God is wrong, right? Why not? Who says we have to think that God is right about morality, right? The most important aspect of objectivity is actually mind independence. And when God is defining morality, what is God using to define it? God is using his mind. Well, that's not a mind-independent process. That's a mind-based process. So mind-based processes are subjective. And so when God is defining goodness, that's not even an objective process. That's a subjective process. This is divine subjectivity, not divine objectivity. So there are a lot of problems with this whole traditional objective moral approach. So thinking about, why should we accept God's definition of goodness? Well, maybe we can look for some MetaOughts, right? The theist, he might be motivated to go find a MetaOught for this conclusion. So perhaps there's a MetaOught of we ought to follow goodness, right? So if goodness is something we ought to do in the first place. And then we can conjoin that to God is goodness, right? And so that's a fact, right? God is goodness. But then you have the question is God objectively good? Is that a true fact? How can you measure God's goodness? Biblically, this method epically fails because the God of the Bible, he violates almost every important commandment he utters. But even if God is good according to his own standard, this is still circular reasoning. You can't use God's definition of goodness to justify his own goodness. You need an external source of goodness to measure God against. So here's a little graphic. It starts with the question, how do you know that God is good? Then we follow it to because God follows the definition of goodness. And then, how do you know the definition of goodness is good? Well, because the God who wrote it is good. Well, we've just built a circular argument, right? The entire justification for the argument just keeps going in a circle. It never finds a true objective justification. Yeah, this argument, it's basically the because I said so argument, right? Whenever the kid asks their parent, well, why? Well, sometimes the parent just resorts to the conclusion, well, because I said so. Well, just because you say so, that's circular. You're not justifying yourself. You're just appealing to yourself. God is good because I say so. I've created the rules of goodness, and the rules of goodness justify myself. So just to make this extra clear, the reason this is problematic is because it goes from God to the justification, right? How do you know God is good? What's that justification? Well, the justification is because God says so, right? Because God is following the definition of goodness that he created, right? So we're moving from God to his own proclamation. And then the question is, well, what about that proclamation? How do we know that that proclamation is good, right? And then it goes just right back to himself. Well, the creator of that proclamation is good. So the creator is good because of the proclamation, and the proclamation is good because of the creator. Do you see how this is circular? Good because of proclamation. Proclamation is good because of creator. It's very problematic. So this leads us into the topic of Euthyphro's dilemma. Euthyphro's dilemma is one of the dialogues of Socrates. Socrates was having a conversation with Euthyphro. And as is typical of Socrates, he likes to challenge people, challenge their understanding of different terms, trying to dig into the definitions and the logic behind how these terms are being used. And so in discussing morality with Euthyphro, they talk about piety. But piety, devotion to the gods. But in kind of more common parlance, we can think about this piety as kind of like virtue or goodness, right? Like moral standards, right? And so Socrates is asking Euthyphro, is virtue loved by the gods because it is good? Or is virtue good because it is loved by the gods, right? As you can see, Socrates, he's trying to separate something that is naturally good versus something that is only good by opinion, right? And here's where we get to divine command theory. Divine command theory is basically the idea that goodness is defined by that which God likes, commands, or ordains. It's just the appeal to authority fallacy, right? We're just going to say, oh, God's the authority, therefore whatever he says is good. The problem with divine command theory is that goodness becomes as arbitrary as an opinion. It's just divine subjectivity. It's just whatever God feels like in the moment. God can flip-flop his opinions, and whatever the current opinion is, that's what goodness is. Divine command theory is probably the easiest way to convince good people to commit atrocities, because there's no amount of evil that can't just be explained away with God's ways are mysterious. In the Bible, God commanded the Israelites to commit genocide. Well, God commanded genocide, therefore genocide is good. It's really good, right? Let's go do it. It's a bad moral foundation. Divine command theory is structured like this. We've got a MetaOught, that we ought to follow goodness. And then we have an is statement, which is God's opinions are good. And then we have the conclusion, we ought to obey God's opinions. The problem is we can't really judge this God's opinions. We haven't figured out a mechanism to get past this divine subjectivity. Natural law goes a step deeper. Natural law theory is basically the idea that good things are good by their nature. So perhaps there is this natural essence of goodness, and the definition of goodness is a priori. It pre-exists any opinion. So if there is something called natural goodness, then this natural goodness is separate from God. It's independent of God. And therefore, God has to adhere to the natural goodness. God's commands have to be consistent with something external to him. right? Only if we have a natural goodness can we judge God's commands. We can say, does this command adhere to the natural goodness? Well, then God has a good command. But if God has a command that doesn't adhere, then God has a bad command, right? So this natural law is a deeper layer of morality that we can use to judge God himself. And the natural law theory can be structured like this. We've got a MetaOught of we should follow goodness, we should be good. And then we have an is, which is goodness is discoverable in nature, right? Goodness is natural. And then there's the ought, which is we ought to obey or follow or adhere with natural goodness. We ought to be in alignment with natural goodness. So just for a simple example, we could try to investigate nature. And based on our investigation, we could come to the conclusion, rightly or wrongly, we could come to the conclusion, perhaps freedom is good, right? Freedom is naturally good. We see all these creatures that are trying to follow their own opinions. They're trying to follow the path that is good for themselves. If you give them freedom, they can follow the path good for themselves. Freedom is good for all these creatures, so they can accomplish their goals. So we come to this conclusion from nature, freedom is good. And then we can look into the scriptures to find God's commands. Maybe some scriptures will say slavery is okay. And then we can say, well, natural goodness says that freedom is good. God has a command that is anti-freedom. So this anti-freedom command, it is immoral. We use this natural law to judge that scripture as immoral. And then maybe there's a different scripture that says slavery is bad, right? And so this different scripture is substantiated by natural law. So it's a question of, are they in alignment or not? So we can structure this paradigm like this. We have this MetaOught, which is we ought to obey natural goodness, right? And then we can look for an is statement. Doctrine A is consistent with natural goodness. Therefore, we ought to obey doctrine A. But then we might have a doctrine B. Doctrine B is not consistent with moral natural goodness. Therefore, we should disregard doctrine B. But one of the tricky things about both of these paradigms is there is a fundamental MetaOught that seems kind of subjective at the root of all of this. There's kind of this I ought to be good at the base of all of these moral theories, right? And it's kind of a subjective opinion, right? There's a lot of subjectivity nested in these hierarchies of these chains of moral logic. It seems very hard to escape this problem of subjectivity. Like, we can't really measure God's goodness with a microscope. And you can't really measure the goodness of freedom with a microscope. It's kind of a little bit of an inductive conclusion. It's not that solid. It's like with physics, we can find particles of energy. We can measure, there's five particles of light. There's 5 particles of electricity, right? But where are the particles of goodness, right? Can we zoom in on freedom and find 5 particles of goodness? We can't. So this subjective paradigm might be structured as follows. We have a subjective ought. We subjectively feel that we ought to be good. And then we have an is. We subjectively feel that God's opinions are good. And then we have a subjective conclusion. We subjectively feel that we ought to obey God, right? Similarly, we subjectively feel that we ought to be good. And then an is statement, we subjectively feel that natural law is good. And then a conclusion, we subjectively feel that we ought to obey natural law. It seems like a lot of subjectivity is baked into this process. The is problem of morality. One way to think about goodness is to define it in relation to our goals. If we want to have a safe society, which would be a goal, then anything that increases crime is bad because it takes us away from that safe society, which is our goal, right? So in this goal paradigm, anything that goes against your destination, anything that goes against the goal would be bad in virtue of its relation to goodness being associated with your goal, right? So we want to have a safe society because a safe society is good. Crime is the opposite of a safe society, therefore crime is bad. But, we could change our goals. What if we like danger? Then our morality might change in accordance with that goal. Maybe we want a dangerous society. So crime would be good if that was our goal. And the problem with this goal paradigm of morality is it makes goodness very arbitrary. We can change the definition of goodness merely by changing our goals, right? This is very similar to the divine command theory, where God is changing the goals. Well, if we take it away from God and give it to ourselves, we have the same problem of this arbitrariness of where exactly are we going with our morality? What is our destination, right? But under this goal paradigm, there's another problem. It's the is problem, right? So the destination would be the ought. Well, when you're traveling somewhere, you've got a starting point. Starting point leads you to you follow the goal to get to the destination from the starting point. And there's a relationship between the destination and the starting point. And that starting point is the facts. It's the situation. It's your circumstance. It's the initial variables, right? The starting point is that initial fact that you have to deal with in order to get to your goal. Now, what's problematic about this? What's problematic about having a starting point? Isn't that a very basic part of reality? Well, with a normal adventure, starting points are very self-evident. But when we're talking about societal goals, we've got very complex starting points, okay? And so people can be wrong about the starting point, because what is this societal starting point? This is an accurate understanding of reality itself. This is an accurate understanding of sociology. This is an accurate understanding of psychology, right? Like, we're dealing with a very complicated starting point, right? So, for example, if we want to have a safe society, well, the starting point might be, what are all the social variables and how do we improve those variables, right? So if the destination is less crime, well, what's the starting crime percentage? Well, that alone is a very complex topic. We got to do a lot of measurements and adjust for some variables to figure out where we're at currently to see if we're making progress or not. So to further expand this model, from the starting point, we could be moving towards the goal, which could be called the utopia, or we could be moving away from the goal, which is towards the dystopia. So let's just say crime is at a percentage of 10%, right? Just for some simplicity's sake. Our starting point is we've got 10% crime. Well, if next year we have 9% crime, then that's good. 9% is good in relation to 10%, right? So we are moving towards utopia at 9%. But the is problem of morality is, what if we've got that 10% wrong? What if we miscalculated? What if the starting point is 2%, right? Our current reality is 2%, and next year we have 9%. Oh crap, we just quadrupled our crime rate. Like 9 is very bad if 2 is the starting point, but 9 is good if 10% is the starting point. So having an off-base starting point completely flips your morality. It flips your understanding of good and evil. Let's think about this at the starting point of a largely unjust society. If things are bad enough, right? So how to put this? If someone is trying to kill you, self-defense is justified, right? It's a common tit-for-tat moral paradigm. So we can expand this individual morality up to the level of society. If a society is evil to the degree of Hitler, right? If you have an extremely evil society, then what becomes moral, right? If your starting point is that bad, then maybe a violent revolution is morally justified, if not morally required, right? If you increase the badness of society, more and more violence becomes justified to try to solve that injustice. And so when we look at society, we could try to judge it based how just is this society. And that would be our starting point for having moral conclusions. And the problem here is if you get your judgment wrong, you will have upside down opinions. And that could be disastrous. Right? You could you could create more problems than you solve if you have your morality upside down. And so trying to get the is correct is very important in order to get the ought correct. So for example, if you judge the society to be as evil as Hitler's Germany, then you're going to think that lots of violence is justified to overturn this system. But if you're completely wrong, if you're completely wrong that this society isn't unjust, and that you've been in echo chambers and you're cherry picking data, and that it's not 100% bad, it's only 1% bad, but you've got this narrow-minded focus, you're only seeing this tiny narrow view of the evidence, and you've got a completely incorrect view of society, then you're going to have the wrong conclusion. Like what you have is a good society, but because of your skewed view, you're going to commit all this violence to destroy a good society, right? So you've come to the wrong conclusion because you got the wrong is. But conversely, if you are correct, if the society is unjust, then you're the hero. When you're going out and sparking a revolution, your violence is morally justified, right? And so the people who are supporting the evil status quo, those are the villains. But we can easily flip it upside down, and the people supporting the status quo are the hero, and the revolutionists are the villains. It all depends on having the correct is. And just another more simple example to make this even more concrete and simplified. If you witness a potential crime scene, right? You witness a crime scene and you see a dead body, and then you see someone standing over the dead body with a gun. Well, you might jump to the conclusion that this person is a murderer, and that you'll jump to the conclusion that they're evil, because your is statement is they killed them and you're assuming it was an unjustified killing. But maybe your is wrong. Maybe there was more facts to the equation. Maybe the person the dead person on the ground, maybe they have a gun, and it was a confrontation and it was self-defense, right? Your is clause is missing some facts, right? This was not an unjustified killing. It was a self-defense killing, and therefore it was justified, right? So the person who was formerly a murderer, with the addition of additional facts, suddenly they become the hero. You go from villain to hero, all by refining that is statement, right? So that's why the facts are so important. If you just assume that you got the right facts, you could be wildly off in your conclusions. Wildly off. And that can be so disastrous, to be wildly off in your moral conclusions. So the is problem of morality is making sure we get the right is. And then we can talk about the ought problem of morality, which is making sure we get the right ought. And this just goes back to the arbitrariness, the subjectivity, moral relativism. It's like we've got all these competing opinions. How do we figure out what the correct oughts are? Because we want the best oughts, or I should say we want the best meta-oughts to be guiding all of our oughts. And we got to figure out what those best oughts or meta-oughts are. So Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher in the 1700s. And he was bothered by English philosopher David Hume and David Hume's philosophy, because David Hume, he had this hypothetical imperative, and it was structured in the form of a goal, like we talked about before. If you want to do X, then you have a moral duty to do Y. And so Immanuel Kant, looking at Hume's morality, he was frustrated by Hume's skepticism towards this moral process. Immanuel Kant, he wanted a more solid foundation for morality. He wanted something more rational, more objective, because Hume's paradigm, this goal paradigm, it suffers from the ought problem. It's like, well, who says what the correct goals are? Hume doesn't give us a way to find what the correct goal is, right? And so Immanuel Kant is frustrated because it's so arbitrary. If you want X, then go do Y, but if you want A, then go do B. That's not good enough to satisfy our desire for something solid to unite all of society around. And so Kant, he started to develop what became termed the categorical imperative. Kant's categorical imperative stated, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So basically, Kant was appealing to the principle that everyone has a moral duty to not be a moral hypocrite, right? So if you internally think that other people should not murder or steal, then you have a duty to follow your own ought statements that you apply to other people. If you want to apply don't murder to someone else, then you have to apply don't murder to yourself, because that's the categorical imperative, that these oughts need to be universal. If you want to apply it to someone else, then it has to be universally applied to you as well. And so you should act in accordance with what you're applying to other people. And so since everyone naturally has moral intuitions, everyone can become obligated to follow these oughts that are within our own souls, if you will. But there's a problem. The problem with Kant's categorical imperative is that while it removes a lot of bias, right? By becoming universal, it subtracts this bias of, oh, I'm the exception, right? But it still falls apart at the collective level, right? Because there's no guarantee that everyone's internal oughts will be the same. Perhaps one group of people believes that it ought to be a universal law that everyone pays taxes, right? I think others should pay taxes. I think I should pay taxes. That should be the universal morality. But there could be another group of people that has the opposite internal ought, and they want to collectivize an opposite internal ought, which is the libertarian point of view. I think all taxes are immoral. I think other people shouldn't pay taxes, and therefore I think I shouldn't pay taxes. They're okay with making a universal law without taxation, and then you have this conflict. The internal intuitions for universal morality are juxtaposed and opposite to each other. If you dig down, the problem at base reality here is that the foundation of this categorical imperative is actually subjective. It's like one group of people subjectively thinks all taxation is bad, and another group thinks all taxation is good. It hasn't truly escaped subjectivity. And so now we're back to the problem of arguing which group is correct. Now we'll turn to evolutionary game theory, right? As I alluded to before, I believe game theory solves a lot of these problems, if not all of them. So what is game theory? Game theory is the study of games, right? It's the study of strategies and how to win a game. And going back to morality in the goal paradigm of morality, right? Well, games, they come prepackaged with goals, right? Once you have a game, you have a goal to win the game. And so life is structured like a game, and the game is survival, surviving and reproducing, right? Whether we like it or not, we're in this game. And so there are natural goals built into this game. And evolution is, it seems like it's the main driver behind our morality, right? If we kind of dig into the structure of, like, even animals have morality, and it kind of makes sense if we think of it from an evolutionary perspective. These moralities are like social strategies, right? So you could have individual strategies, but then animals start to learn how to cooperate, and then the social strategy evolves, and morality seems to be the name for social strategy. And so in evolution, if you rely on society to win the game, then you rely on morality. Morality would be a survival tool to win as a society. The traditional perspective on evolution is that it's kind of this Hobbesian hellscape where all these animals are ripping each other to shreds, and it's dog eat dog, it's survival of the fittest, right? Only the strongest, most tyrannical, most powerful, most abusive and manipulative, those are the ones that win, right? That's kind of the traditional view of evolution. But more and more, the perspective of evolution is evolving towards a cooperation paradigm, where it seems like cooperation is superior to competition, right? These individual strategies, like you can try to be the number one, number one chimp and beat up all the other chimps. You can try to do that, but the empirical evidence shows that if you're an abusive chimp leader, then your people are going to rebel against you. There'll be a revolution, and the chimp underlings are going to assassinate the abusive chimp, and a more cooperative, more friendly, more fair, more just chimp is going to take his place in the hierarchy. And so what this is kind of showing is that within this moral paradigm, there's multiple layers of strategy, and these chimps, they're operating on this tit for tat strategy, right? So it's like I'm going to cooperate, but if you're abusive, I'm going to get revenge on you, right? Assassinating the abusive leader, that's a revengeful tactic. And so once you've got this tit for tat revenge, these abusive strategies lose their potency. They lose their power. They lose their game theoretic success, right? If you're going to rank all the strategies, the abusive strategy loses a lot of winning points, and the cooperative strategy starts gaining lots of points, because these social systems, 3 people are more powerful than 1 alpha male, right? 3 chimps can go outcompete the abusive male. Maybe the abusive one, he's the strongest one-on-one, but he's not the strongest 1 versus 3. And so in a society, there's multiple people that you have to please. You don't get that 1 versus 1 comparison. And so the social strategy is, how do I be the best at keeping everyone working together, right? How do I facilitate justice, right? If everyone in your tribe is fighting, you're not going to have an efficient tribal strategy, right? Tribal war, if one tribe is self-destructive, they're murdering each other, they're stealing from each other, they're getting revenge on each other. If one tribal strategy is very immoral, right? And another strategy is very cooperative, which one is going to reproduce faster? Which one is going to have a bigger tribal army, right? So cooperative tribes are going to win the game of tribal warfare. And so you can kind of see that our human instincts to it's wrong to murder, well, you're harming the social strategy. Stop infighting. We're a team, right? And you can see how we could evolve. Don't steal. Yeah, like maybe there's an individual benefit, but why should you harm the tribe for an individual benefit, right? And the tribe, right, in terms of evolution, the question is, which is more important for your genes? Your individual success or the tribal success? Right? And that there's a cost benefit. Well, you can harm the tribe to get individual benefit, or you can help the tribe at personal cost, but maybe your genes are dispersed in the tribe. You've got cousins, you've got nephews and nieces, you've got all of your genes dispersed in the tribe. Maybe a heroic strategy is justified. If I give to charity, if I share with the group, I'm incurring a cost to my personal genes, but I'm boosting the success of my genes in the tribe. So we can see how this selflessness becomes a moral virtue, because morality is that social strategy. I am giving of myself to help this tribe succeed. But of course, it's still complicated. Just because evolutionary game theory manipulates your genes to do something doesn't mean that evolution was correct in how it manipulated you, right? Evolution might manipulate a sociopath to go murder or, rape, steal, whatever. That doesn't mean all those things are good. That goes back to the appeal to nature fallacy. It goes back to the naturalistic fallacy. Goodness is not the same as that which is natural. It's complicated. But I address this in more detail in my other videos. Go check those out. But you can see we kind of have a foundation for looking at how subjective axioms help build our morality, right? We can start to see how moral intuitions form a tree of branching conclusions that start to inform all these oughts that are downstream of our meta values. And we might be able to try to map out these structures by digging into our psyche and trying to self-elucidate our own values, right? And so this would be an example of a mapping structure. We have a hierarchy of meta-ises and meta-oughts. Meta-is, meta-ought. Then the next layer of is-ought. And then the next layer of is-ought. And multiple ises and multiple oughts. And so this is just to articulate there's multiple levels to this. Morality is complicated. We've got to look at large numbers of levels. And just to show how complicated this can get, I tried to outline a really long chain of logic, which is about 20 lines long, 20 layers of moral logic. This is kind of an exploration of how to justify morality, and it starts to kind of get circular. So you can explore this if you want, but I think I addressed this better in my other videos. But this was a good exercise for me, right? As I was going through the 20 layers of moral logic, I was trying to see where this leads. If I keep digging deeper, right? I've got my moral conclusion. Well, what's deeper? Well, what's a layer deeper? What's a layer deeper? I was doing this as an exercise to explore within myself, how deep could I go? And I found that it was very hard to escape the appeal to nature fallacy. It was very hard to escape Hume's guillotine, because everything seems to fundamentally reduce to what is, right? If you just keep going back, right? We're going to dig back, dig back, dig back. Well, if you dig back as far as you can go, just keep digging, keep digging. What do you get at rock bottom when you dig as far as you can go? Well, you get the Big Bang. And what is the Big Bang? There's no oughts in the Big Bang. The Big Bang just is. So in my other videos, I highlight how you can derive principles from the Big Bang. But it essentially reduces to isness at rock bottom. But if you remember from before, I was saying that one of the most primordial oughts seems to be the ought that we ought to be good, right? But just because there's a Big Bang, just because the universe exists, well, that doesn't mean we ought to be good, right? So where is that coming from? So often we're trying to look for something to justify the jump. How do we jump from is to ought? And religion often tries to justify this with punishments, right? Religion says, well, you ought to be good because if you're good, we reward you with heaven, and if you're bad, you suffer with hell. Well, what is religion appealing to? Religion is appealing to well-being. Heaven is positive well-being. Hell is negative well-being. Well, who says that we ought to have well-being? That's not a part of the Big Bang, right? And so even religion is jumping the gap. And so it kind of becomes a circular thing where we can't escape our feeling of well-being. We just axiomatically desire well-being, and we have a hard time escaping that. It's like the Big Bang gave us our system of well-being, and we can't really escape the fact that we desire it. Like, you can logically, convolute an argument that, well, I don't necessarily want to avoid suffering, but if you like suffering, then it isn't true suffering. If you like it, it's pleasure. So suffering is only that which you don't like, and therefore it's like it's almost axiomatically something that we ought not do. It's like built into the definition of the term. But nothing about existence requires us to want to feel good. It's just part of our constitution. Nothing about existence requires that we want to avoid suffering. So it's back to this problem of subjectivity. It's really hard to escape that subjective well-being as a foundation. And to kind of graph or diagram this out, we have the MetaOught. Subjectively, we care about personal, eternal well-being. And then there's the is statement. Good people go to heaven and bad people go to hell. So if you care about well-being, which we do, and this is the facts of reality is heaven and hell, then I ought to be a good person because I care about this stuff, right? And also you can just reduce it to biology. So subjectively, we care about personal biological well-being. And then the is statement is good people are psychologically happy. Bad people are psychologically sad. And so you take these statements and you can get an ought, which is I ought to be a good person. And that concludes our discussion on moral logic.